Afternoon. Welcome to your last YouTube lecture, week 8 for political violence and terrorism. And I just want to start off by saying it's been a pleasure to have you guys in class. It was good. I think it was a good class for me. I learned something every time I do this, and I hope you got something out of the class as well. Please keep me as a point of contact. For whether you need a recommendation in the future, advice on jobs, further networking. As part of your deal with George Washington University, you get me as an asset for that. So if you need it, please take advantage. If you're coming to the DC area and you want to talk about jobs or anything, feel free to give me a call, or I can even meet you for coffee or something like that. So just again, sometimes it's not what you know, it's who you know, and having more contacts is always better. So for the final is going to be just like the exams that you've had before, except it's going to be longer, 15 of 25 questions. It says 500 words. Just don't do 500 words. Do like 200 to 250 words a question. Nothing more than that. The key is because you only get 3 hours for the exam, is that you label all the PowerPoint presentations so you can access them pretty easily. If you do that, you'll do fine. If you've been plugging away at the exams and most of you have gotten full credit for all your questions, you'll do fine on the final. It's nothing really to worry about. Course summaries, please do them. This is my first class, and I need the feedback. I'll be teaching you guys again in the future, so any lessons or issues you have, you can actually incorporate them, or I can incorporate them and push them for further classroom discussion, or for further improvements for later classes. If you have issues, like major issues, go ahead and send them to me personally, or you have some things that are good, bad, need improvement, feel free to send them to me personally too, and I can improve right from there. Just some of the things that I think I'm going to change with the class. I'm going to probably get rid of the exams. GW requires them for certain distance learning classes. I think we can almost do away with them though. The second thing I want to do is for future classes is switch to a synchronous class, which means that we use some sort of web video forum to actually talk over the internet. And we meet at like Wednesday, 6 o'clock, and we can go from there. So everyone is meeting, everyone is discussing, and we do video chats over the internet, things like that. I know that hoses you if you're in Afghanistan or Iraq, but we could probably put that on a podcast and go from there. If I do that, I can actually take away some of the exams, take away the discussion board, a lot of the discussion boards, and keep it as much as a classroom environment as possible. And the next thing I'm going to probably do is just try and use a digital whiteboard for the lectures instead of the PowerPoint. If any of you are familiar with the Khan Academy, that's one thing I want to do to implement in class. So, and then the final thing is I'll probably add a WMD terrorism class to this class. I think that's something you'll get in future classes, but if we're talking about terrorism, the WMD terrorism issue is probably the biggest one you'll face. That has the most catastrophic consequences. So I think we should touch on that, and I'll be sure to incorporate that for another class. So with that being said, I just want to wrap it up and this is not necessarily going to be an exam, but as terrorism experts and professionals who are in the national security realm, these are kind of the takeaways you should be getting from this class. The first, terrorism did not begin with Al-Qaeda, and this goes back to the earlier classes. Terrorism did not begin with Al-Qaeda, and it did not start on 9/11. You should know, what the Irgun did. We talked about that in Israel. You should know what the FLN did in Algeria. That's, it's people who have advanced knowledge of terrorism studies. You all should have seen the movie One Day in September and known that terrorism is primarily a publicity stunt. It was used to advance your cause and get a world stage. So that's number one. Number two, terrorism works. It works. The One Day in September is probably the best example because they had the Palestinians had the worldwide publicity, they were able to advance their cause in the medium. If terrorism did not work, no one would do it, but it works. It achieves its, more times than not, it achieves its objective. Third thing, differing definitions. We can't agree between agencies what the definition of terrorism is, and we cannot certainly agree between cultures, nations, etc. This is an investigative challenge because Saudi Arabia, they necessarily don't feel that attacks against troops, Khobar towers, is an act of terrorism. And they're not going to give you the same cooperation as if you were doing it in England or in France. So we don't still have a good definition of terrorism, and it's still a very loose area. 4, this goes back to the cross-national. The EU and the US deploy different strategies to defeat terrorism. Whether one works or not, that was part of the discussion before, but it's I wouldn't say vastly different, but it's considerably different. The European Union strategy versus the United States. Point 5, terrorism groups have different structures, different methods for attack, different ways to finance terrorism. ETA in Spain is different than the PLO, which is different than Hamas, which is different than the Haqqani network. And based on the structures of these groups, certain strategies work. For instance, interdicting finance for transnational terrorism will work on some groups, it will not work on others. High-value targeting will work on very highly structured groups. It will not work on loosely affiliated groups. Amnesty programs, again, may work under certain conditions, it may not work under certain conditions. So whatever strategy you have is based on the structure and organization of the group, and we studied those in depth. 6th, when you're countering terrorism, you need to isolate the variables. And what I mean by that is when we're defeating a terrorist organization, we're looking at counterterrorism, we have to ask, what worked, what didn't, what was worth financing to defeat it. For example, in Algeria, in late 90s, the best thing that defeated the insurgency there was an amnesty program. Was that the primary variable, though? Were there other things that worked? In this case, the amnesty program was the primary vehicle to defeat the insurgency. But in other cases, Hamas in Gaza, and this was brought up in one of the papers, high-value targeting was used as your strategy. So if you're going to say high-value targeting was used and was a primarily way, you have to account for the other variables that led to the demise of the terrorist organization. And in these budget-constrained times, you would have to brief, hey, we think that the best strategy is a high-value targeting program in concert with a financial interdiction program to defeat whatever terrorist organization you're looking at. 7th, and I'd say the final kind of takeaway is, and a lot of you brought this up in your papers, is kind of these low-level security assistance missions. And what am I talking about here? When we're looking at places like the Philippines, Yemen, North Africa, we have troops, from a U.S. perspective, we have troops in those areas that are actually countering terrorism. And the question is, how do we make those security assistance missions as effective as possible? Now, if you're, from a counterterrorism strategy, let's say you're in the National Security Council, well, let me backtrack. No one wants to put 150,000 troops into Yemen. No one wants to put 150,000 troops into Libya, using the same tactics that we used in Iraq and Afghanistan, massive counterinsurgency, building up government structured. No one's going to do that anymore. So how do you defeat terrorism with that in mind? And the best example is things like what we did in the Philippines, things that we're doing in Yemen now, although that's diminished in the last couple of years, our security assistance missions in Mali, in East Africa, where small teams of Americans plussed up with ISR assets work with the locals to defeat terrorism. That is the primary goal that needs to happen, and how we do that is going to depict the proper counterterrorism strategy going forward. So with that being said, that's the class. I look forward to the final papers, and if there's any issues, please let me know.